I'm Peter Kurti, Research Fellow at the Center for Independent Studies. Our guest at the Center today is Professor Efraim Inbar, who's Professor of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University and the Director of the Begin-Sadat Center for Strategic Studies. His area of specialization is Middle Eastern strategic issues, with a special interest in the politics and strategy of Israeli national security. He's here at the Center to talk about the turmoil in the Middle East and its aftermath. Professor Inbar, welcome to the Center for Independent Studies.
Thank you very much. My pleasure being here.
With every Middle East country at each other's throat at the moment, the Arab Muslim world seems to be very uncertain about its own fate. Some of its totalitarian regimes were toppled in the so-called Arab Spring, but they have yet to be replaced by stable governments. It seems that the battle for the future of the Middle East is still being fought. What do you think is at the heart of this turmoil in the Middle East that you come to speak about?
I think that the Arab world and the Arab states that were established about 100 years ago are facing a terrible crisis. And the crisis is about modernization. The Arab states have failed to produce the type of leadership that we've seen maybe in Turkey or in Korea, in Taiwan, that pushed their countries into a modern course. And as a result of this failure, recently the people, being able to see via the new media how other people live in the world, feel very frustrated.
So the roots of the movement are popular roots, and they are roots that are fed by a yearning for a different way of life, a more modern, a more Western way of life.
Yes, definitely. I'm not sure it's about freedom. I'm sure that it is about having a better standard of living. Most people are not political, but they don't want to be harassed by tyrants, and they think they deserve a better life.
Democracy is a word that's used a lot these days in discussions about the Arab Spring. Do you think that democracy is actually, or concerns about democracy are actually an important part of the turmoil? And if so, is everybody operating with the same conception of democracy?
I'm not sure that at this time, in the development of the Arab world, democracy is the issue. I think the issue is, as I mentioned, modernization, maybe creation of a large middle class that will allow eventually to become democratic. The Arab world will have to take a historic process in order to become democratic. It took Europe several hundred years, and maybe this time can be compressed under certain conditions. And we've seen an attempt by the Americans to impose democracy on Iraq. And they put a lot of resources in their conquest of Iraq. And unfortunately, this adventure has failed.
Does it fail, though, because of the absence of a totalitarian state, or because of the presence of a totalitarian state? Because it seems that when the totalitarian states, like in Egypt, when Mubarak was in office, there is a regime that can prevent modernization, it can prevent what we might call westernization. Once that regime collapses, what then are the obstacles to reform?
Democracy is not only about elections. Democracy is about having institutions, about having a political culture that is pragmatic, is tolerant, and those elements are still missing in Arab societies, where identities are formed primarily by sectarian, ethnic, tribal belonging.
Do you think that the concept of the nation state is under threat in the region, and that we're seeing now a collapse, in a sense, of the identity of the nation state and a reversion to earlier definitions or demarcations?
Definitely. I think that those states have faced from the very beginning a threat to the conception of nation state. We have no national identities as we know them in the West. For example, we have a civil war in Syria now. We all know that it's not Syrians fighting Syrians. It's actually Alawis fighting Sunnis, Druze participating and helping the Alawis, Christians joining this coalition. So we are not talking about state identities. And in the Arab world, we've seen transnational ideological movements that are challenging the concept of national state. For example, Pan-Arabism. From the very beginning, there were many intellectuals that demanded a different map of the Middle East, not composed of states, but one state in which all Arab-speaking people will become part.
Just to stay with the example of Syria, and to come back to that, given the fact that we're not talking about, as it were, national identity now there, what sort of outcome do you expect to see, you yourself expect to see in Syria?
First of all, I don't know what will happen in Syria. It's difficult to predict. We may see continuation of this conflict for a while. It seems that ethnic groups have a lot of energies, particularly when their mere existence is threatened. The stakes are extremely high. The Alawites in Syria are afraid of losing control, the grip over power, because they fear a massacre. We've seen it in Africa and other places, that ethnic groups can behave in a very brutal way toward other ethnic groups. So it's a conflict that may continue for a while.
And one of the things I think is difficult for people in countries like Australia or the United Kingdom or the United States, they like to look at a conflict and be able to see who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And when it's difficult to do that, I think we become confused and ultimately even bored with the complexity, the draining complexity of this sort of conflict. Because we don't seem to have the categories for understanding tribal loyalty.
Yes, because in Australia and many Western countries, those tribal loyalties have been eroded a few hundred years ago. Many Westerners are used to divide societies according to class definitions. And this type of typology has no value whatsoever in ethnic conflict. The American, as well as others, can affect very little what's happening in the Middle East. We have to understand that the expectations that outsiders can fix the Middle East or can do good are greatly exaggerated.
Can I, on that note, move to talk about Iran and ask you about Iran? The Israeli Prime Minister, Prime Minister Netanyahu, recently issued, if not a warning about Iran, certainly voiced the Israeli skepticism about Iran and its new president. Why do you think many commentators in the West remain skeptical about Netanyahu's concerns and his warnings?
I think that people don't want to hear the bad news, because if they realize that there are bad news, they have to do something about it. And the West is reluctant to act. We see much weakness on part of the West, lack of determination, and tremendous hope for having peace, for having a rosy world. And unfortunately, some people in this world do not behave like a British gentleman.
So Western weakness or Western rosiness would be one of the challenges that Israel faces in addressing this turmoil and living through it in the region. What are the other challenges for Israel rising from the turmoil, and how do you think Israel will address them?
Well, I think first of all we should realize that the fragile Arab states that disintegrate, that are being fractured, creates better conditions for terrorism, for two reasons. Once countries lose control over their territory, for example, Egypt loses control over Sinai, or Libya has lost its control over its territory, and we see militias in those states, there is greater freedom of action for terrorists. In addition, some of the state arsenals are more accessible to the terrorists. We know that part of the Libyan arsenals military arsenals have ended up in the hands of Hamas in Gaza. Another repercussion is, of course, the creation of East Mediterranean, which may become an Islamic lake. Most of the countries around it have adopted Islamic governments, and this is an important area for Israel. What, however, is the most pressing issue is a nuclear Iran. A nuclear Iran is an issue, a strategic issue of an entirely higher order for three main reasons. One, it affects nuclear proliferation. You may see other countries becoming nuclear. Second, a nuclear Iran may affect the prices of oil, a strategic commodity. If they become nuclear, they will have a better handle on the oil that is found in the Gulf and also in the Caspian Basin, where they have also a coast there. And finally, international terrorism. Iran is a country that is on the list of states supporting terrorism, and they will be emboldened by having a nuclear bomb. So Iran is the main issue in the Middle East, and this has to be tackled. I'm afraid that in the absence of determination on part of the West to put an end to the Iranian nuclear program, Israel will have to act alone.
And Israel manages to retain the energy and the suppleness and the resourcefulness, often it seems on its own, to address these issues. To what do you attribute the tirelessness of Israel?
I think you are correct in describing the great social resilience of Israelis in face of protracted conflict. Part of it is a feeling of no choice. If we do not win the wars, we'll be annihilated. Second, I think it's part of the education of Israelis. They know that at the age of 18, they go into the military and fight for their country. And they cherish the mere fact that there is a Jewish state that has to be defended, and they are ready to sacrifice their lives for the well-being of the state. And it is the mothers that send their children. And we have little emigration out of the country, which means that most people do not exercise the exit option.
Professor Efraim Inbar, thank you very much indeed for joining us at the CIS today.
You're welcome. My pleasure.